Ron, there was another question from about the manipulatives that sometimes
Mhm.
they're available in problems and sometimes they aren't. Is there any kind of pattern to that or plans to?
Yes. Yeah. So the manipulatives may not be available if you're playing on a small screen. And the reason for that is just because there's not enough real estate or size on that screen in order to display the manipulatives at all times. So if you're playing on a phone, for example, that might be the reason why you're not seeing the manipulatives. And it's just because there's not enough room on the phone for us to pop those up. But if you play on a bigger iPad or computer, you will see the manipulatives there. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback as well. Same iPad. It seems totally random. Okay. Let me follow up with you after that because it should be there. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to kind of show you here that you might want to use is what's called the curriculum progress report. The advantage of this report is you can actually see how your student is doing against the actual standards in grade 4. So for example, if I'm a Florida parent here and I'm aligned to the Florida standards, this will allow me to go into the specific standards, for example, in number sense. And then anywhere you see this yellow or red triangle, this is where your students might be struggling. So I'm going to go into this. This is multiplying two whole numbers, each up to 2 digits using a standard algorithm. And here I notice that some of these students are having trouble with multiplying 2 digit by 2 digit numbers. So what this might allow you to do as a parent is as students are progressing through Prodigy's curriculum, we will actually flag areas that they are struggling so that you might be able to help them in your homeschool practice in those particular areas, as opposed to covering everything. And the skills that they have mastered, you'll be able to see their name in the mastered column here. So you can see they've got this down. You don't necessarily need to spend any more time on it. Finally, one other thing that I will say is in terms of how the Prodigy curriculum works. So there is a placement test that runs for every student the first time that they come in, or every school year, we actually reset the placement test and they get to rerun through the placement test. What that does is it allows us to see where to start students in the curriculum. And our algorithm, the goal of that is to keep every student in what's called their zone of proximal development. So that means that they're optimally challenged in learning, but the questions aren't too difficult to the extent that they get frustrated and give up. And if we determine that they're struggling in a particular area as they're going through the game, we actually pull them back to prerequisite skills. So to give you an example, let's say I'm working on fractions and comparing fractions with unlike denominators. Well, if the denominator has a 5 in it when I'm comparing those fractions, maybe the skill that I'm struggling in is multiplying by fives. Because if I can't multiply by fives, I can't compare those two denominators. And we'll pull your students back to that skill. If they're still struggling with multiplying by fives, we'll actually pull them back to skip counting by fives. If they're struggling in skip counting by fives, we'll pull them back to skip counting by ones or twos. So we're always trying to find what is the prerequisite skill that your child might be struggling in and try to build some competency and mastery in that skill and then pull them back up to skill level. So that is a perfect example of mastery-based learning, which Manisha had mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. And that's a technique I used a lot as a tutor to help kids build confidence. And somehow when you have confidence, it just makes it more fun. Because, let's say you have a profoundly gifted child who's just racing through every single thing. It becomes boring and frustrating for them. And if you can get to something where it's a little bit hard, so you have to push a little and you have to make that achievement, then it gets exciting and fun. But if it's too hard and too frustrating, then you start to feel stupid and give up. So that's also it's a really great way to help that frustration and confidence. Profoundly gifted kids can move through this curriculum very, very quickly. And I think that sometimes, when you are teaching with them, like just taking that moment to stop and pause and say, can you explain this back to me? Can be a really helpful way to turn Prodigy from just a supplement into a more main curriculum and really deepen that understanding.
That's a great point. The other thing I'll say, which is not fully related to Prodigy, is Prodigy is a great practice and assessment tool for your kids, but it's not a silver bullet when it comes to your homeschooling practice. So where we found Prodigy to work best is when it's paired with, and there's kind of three categories of tools that I have heard homeschoolers that I've talked to use in their practice when it comes to math. So one is a core curriculum. And that's kind of, I'd asked the question earlier. It seems like most of you do have a core curriculum that you're using as well, or a textbook that you're following. Second is a practice or assessment tool. And that's where Prodigy fits. Like we can help you make sure that your kids practice the questions, understand those questions, and master the fundamental skills there. And then the third is a video lesson or lesson tool to potentially help you supplement some of those. And there are a lot of resources here available for free. Like there's a bunch of YouTube channel. Manisha had suggested Math Antics. I was watching their long division video. They do a fantastic job. There's also some paid tools here. So I've heard from other homeschoolers that they use. One that has come up a few times is Nicole the Math Lady. And I know that she integrates specifically with Saxon Math and I believe Singapore Math as well.
Absolutely. And I think that, what's great about YouTube is that you can find a teacher that your child resonates with. Someone is going to find the math antics guy hilarious and someone else is not going to understand what they're talking about. And, I do like to use Prodigy as kind of a jumping off point because I think it comes back to that idea of what's the point of me learning this? Because the way a lot of math curriculum is structured is that you get this long explanation of a problem and then you're supposed to solve a bunch of problems. But if you start with a problem, like a challenge, and then you pull in different resources to support answering that problem, it can give you a lot more meaning to what you're learning.
Absolutely. So if you have kind of those three categories of tools and you can pick the curriculum that you like the best, you can pick the video lessons that you like the best, as Manisha said, that actually resonates with your particular child. I find that combination can really help accelerate your homeschool practice.
And Prodigy
One
can also be
last,
really useful if you do decide to go with a tutor. Tutors can be expensive. There are free tutoring tools like schoolhouse.world. We also pair families with free tutors if they can't afford it. But if you want to find like an inexpensive college tutor, it can be really useful to give them Prodigy to provide them with a structure for their lessons. So to make sure you're not just bringing in these random worksheets and jumping around to all these concepts, but you're actually following a path. Prodigy can give you that path, and then the tutor can kind of fill in the blanks. And it can be nice even having an older homeschooler kid. If your kids are just really not communicating around math with you, it just happens, and it's totally fine to bring in someone. Maybe you could teach writing to another kid and they could teach your kid math. But we found with Mastery Hour, when we were just kind of throwing the tutors into the lion's den and helping with math, it didn't really go very well. But then we brought in Prodigy to support them and give them some structure and just really changed our progress quite a bit.
amazing. One last thing that I'll show you on the Prodigy platform here is something called the student activity report. So you can get to it by clicking on the reports tab here. And if you click view report on the student activity report, I'll be able to see Adam B's activity here. In this case, I'm doing it for the last 90 days. And you can see that he's answered a lot of questions on Prodigy. But if I go into grade 3, for example, here, and I go into fractions, I can see what questions he is answering here. And I will have to zoom into this one to see what the question is. And you can actually get a preview of what he might be, specifically what he might be learning within Prodigy. The other thing that I can use this for is in the cases that I can see that in grade 1, grade 3 skills, he's doing really well, very high accuracy. He's starting to get into grade 8. And Adam's actually not a grade 8 student. He's a grade 6 student here. So he's starting to get a little bit more advanced in the Prodigy curriculum, which is fantastic. You can see where he might be having difficulty. And in this case, he's having some challenges with the Pythagorean theorem. So if you want to take a look here at the questions that specifically that he might be struggling with, this provides you as a parent the opportunity to see the question, and you might be able to just pop this on your screen and do it as a kind of impromptu lesson with your child.
Yeah, Heather had a really good question in the chat kind of about how the adaptive learning works, how the students automatically guided, even if you don't provide them with specific problems or topics.
Yes, that is a very good question, Heather. So essentially how the algorithm works, and I think I have a slide here that might explain it a little bit better. So let me go here really quickly. So your child is playing the game by default. They're obviously getting math questions. So the first thing that they do in terms of the curriculum is the placement test. After they complete the placement test, which typically takes like 1 to 2 sessions, it's not a set number of questions that are in the placement test. It could be, 20 questions. It could be 50 questions that they have to answer. It depends on how far they're progressing through the curriculum. Then they're put on that adaptive path, and that's where we adapt. The way that the assignments come into your question is the assignments take precedence over the other two things. So if you have an active assignment, there is no way to avoid that. And that's also the first questions that they see the next time that they log into the game. If you don't have an assignment, that's when they go back to kind of the adaptive path. So that is how the curriculum works. A lot of parents use the assignments as kind of sneaky assessments for your child. So they don't know that they're doing the questions that you have assigned them specifically. There's nothing to indicate to say, hey, your parent has given you, 10 questions on fractions. But that is the first 10 questions that they will see when they get onto the game. And after that, they just move back to where they left off on the adaptive path. Hope that helps answer your question. Awesome. Fantastic.
Cool. Well, we really want to give you guys a little space to ask more questions. And I don't know if you feel comfortable turning your cameras on and asking us, or if you want to put them in the chat. These questions are so nuanced and so dependent on individual children. Is there anyone who wants to troubleshoot and bounce up ideas with us? Okay, if you're trying to get up your courage, I actually have some of your. Okay, yeah. Okay, so Heather mentioned a new science path. Want to.
Yes, that's a great question. So, science is a brand new subject that we've added. So, to be honest, it is a little bit less of a fulsome curriculum versus our math curriculum. For math, we have almost every skill, grades 1 through 8 for the math curriculum, and it is a member only feature. So, if you are a premium member on Prodigy, you can get access to the science curriculum. And when you log into your student's account, it'll ask you if you want to learn math or science, essentially. And if you say science, you'll be able to get the science questions within Prodigy there. And then Kara asked, does it matter what grade I technically label my child with initially? It does, because that gives us a bit of a starting point. So when we do our placement test, we actually consider that grade, but we don't take it as a concrete kind of line in the sand. So what we do is we actually start with questions a couple grade levels below to see if your students might have mastered those already, or might still be having difficulty. And then we try to work them up to the grade level that you've selected. And then we try to work them even a little bit beyond that to see where the right place to start them is.